My name is Dr. Patrice Lagoy. I'm an international psychologist, licensed marriage and family therapist, and former entertainment executive. This episode, we will be discussing mental health in times of disaster, how we're affected, and what can help us through the process of recovery. My guest today is Dr. Sylvie Taylor. Dr. Taylor has been providing disaster mental health services and training for over 30 years. During her career, she has served disaster survivors, helpers, communities, and organizations following numerous natural and person-made disasters. Welcome, Dr. Taylor.
Thank you for
for
having
being
me.
here. So I first wanted to ask you, of course, here in Los Angeles, the wildfires are still top of mind for us. And we know that this is not something, that's unique to Los Angeles, unique to our community. So I really think it'd be helpful for people to understand, like, how does a crisis impact people's mental and physical health?
Okay, so disasters, we always think about disasters as having a set of normal responses to
Mhm.
an abnormal situation. And one of the real challenges of a disaster is it taxes all of our resources,
Mm.
right? You have this big event and everything gets energized and activated, and we're using all of our resources very
Yes.
rapidly. So it's very common for people, obviously, who are directly impacted. So in the cases of the fires, people who lost homes, who
Mhm.
lost businesses, et cetera, to be highly agitated, have trouble sleeping, have trouble eating, feeling very anxious, some people feeling very depressed. And we really, early on in a disaster, think about those as normal
Mm.
reactions to a highly abnormal
Okay.
situation.
Okay.
So part of the work very early in a disaster is try to help people get to a place where they're stable, where
Mhm.
they can have a stable place to live, where things become a new normal,
Yeah.
but where things settle down. And then we're hoping that within the first month or so, those kinds of experiences that are very highly disruptive in the beginning start to settle down.
Okay.
But the other thing about disaster that's interesting is it impacts everybody.
Mm.
So we have to think about our first responders,
Yes.
right, who have to witness these things and are rescuing people and often, come up against, with the fires, what do you do with hurricane force winds?
Yeah.
That's not something that someone can control,
Mhm.
right? So there's those kinds of issues. Then there are people who are not directly impacted, but whose lives are impacted because it's their friends, their neighbors, their family members.
Yes.
And then there's the rest of the community where we may not have any direct
Mhm.
impact, but we're seeing it on the news, we're hearing it.
Yeah.
People who don't even live in Los Angeles, people who are across the country, seeing this on the news, and it's highly distressing. So the other thing that's unique about disaster is everybody is
Yes.
impacted.
Yes, in different ways. And, I think that sometimes, kind of taking this little by little, we obviously know what, the impact is if you've lost, your home, if you've lost, your community, and you're probably just trying to figure out what do I do tomorrow?
Mhm.
How do I live? How do I take care of my family? And I think sometimes that we can forget that, like you said, everyone is impacted in
Mhm.
different ways and, can feel different levels of either helplessness or guilt,
Mhm.
if they were fine. And so like, I want to understand how, like, each one of those groups, what happens for them. And then also, like you said, their new normal,
Right.
what we should be thinking about as far as if it's longer than the first month and so on, we're still
Right.
having symptoms. What does
So
that look like?
I think what we want to be seeing, and when we think about people who are directly
Hmm.
impacted,
Hmm.
you know, oftentimes the post-disaster stabilization may not necessarily be consistent,
Okay.
right? So for example, we might have someone who lost their home who is now living with relatives. And the relatives are, okay, we need our house back,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So they may need to move again.
Hmm.
So that's going to create another sort of upheaval,
Yes.
right? So, sometimes we see a little bit of ebb and flow.
Hmm.
But what we're hoping to see over time is, for example, if someone wasn't sleeping, was having trouble eating, we want to see it getting better.
Okay.
So maybe it's not exactly the way it was before, but we want to see it getting better.
Okay.
And the other part is really one of the things that we do a great deal of in disaster mental health is to try to educate survivors. These are things that you should expect because these are normal reactions. But if this continues, then we really want you to get some additional support.
Okay.
We know that for children, we tend to see for young children, often they will regress, right? So a child who used to suck their thumb all of a sudden starts
Yes.
doing it again,
Yes.
want to sleep in bed with parents, don't want to go to school, get more clingy, get more, more tantrums, more sort of behavior that maybe had gone away as they got more mature. So they kind of go a little bit backwards.
Okay.
The counterintuitive thing for children, though, is we want to try to get them back into things that seemed like their regular routine.
Okay.
To be with other kids, to go back to school,
Yes.
to do those things to the degree that the environment has stabilized.
Can you tell us why that's so important?
Well, it's interesting. Children are extraordinarily resilient, right? And if they can get back into those kinds of routines, there are two things that happen for them. So being able to play, being able to sort of escape from those things. So the routine, for example, of school, the predictability, right? School has a pattern. Right. And even if a child had to go to a new school, it's still a familiar kind of thing. We line up, we go, we sit, we do
have
this, we
recess,
have lunch,
yes,
we have
exactly.
recess, right? There's that predictability. But the other thing that it does is a very unique thing for adults. When children get back to being kids, they laugh.
Yes.
They get playful. And that reminds us as adults, we've got work to do.
That's right.
We've got to look out these little guys.
We have to pull ourselves together maybe in that moment because they need us, and you want to hear more of that laughter. You know, Dr. Taylor, I know that you have done disaster work, all over the world. Can you tell me some examples of like where you've seen that at work with the kids being able to get back to play?
I did some work following the earthquake in Haiti and also the hurricane in Puerto Rico. And one of the things that was interesting in both settings is being able to, oftentimes I find myself when I go to these settings doing stuff with kids. And when I was in Haiti, we were making water. The Pure Company has these things that they offer for disasters, and it's a packet of powder. You can put it in sewer water anywhere. You stir it for half an hour. You let it sit. You sift it through a T-shirt or any piece of clean cloth, and then it's drinkable.
Okay.
And I'm sitting there doing this with kids, and they're finding this hilarious because they're looking at this water and they're like, I'm not going to drink that.
That's disgusting.
and then we have this clean water, and then they watch me drink it, and they're all laughing. And we were making parachutes with plastic bags and rocks and string, and there's just laughter. And what you see the adults doing, all of a sudden, the posture changes, right? You see this sort of physical thing. You see the hugs that are... The hugs are there, but they're more joyful, right? It's because there is a lot of that reaction of parents where I'm going to hold you tight, but it feels kind of desperate.
Yes.
When the kids are laughing and they're energized, then it's that hug of, ooh, I love you, right? And you see that physical change in people's being.
That's so powerful because I do think it is natural, and we've talked about this before, that parents like, I want to keep an eye on you because I'm worried now.
Absolutely.
And this, of course, is, like we said, is not unique to what's happened here. But I think that especially for people who maybe weren't with their children and, had to leave and that kind of thing, that is terrifying.
Absolutely.
And to your point, that's not the thing that's going to help our kids kind of get back to where they need to be. Or us, I guess, for that matter, too.
Yeah, and I think it also, it's so important for us to be reminded that human beings are so resilient, right? People have lived through horrific things and and come through on the other side and kind of figured it out. And we have to remind ourselves that is the history of humanity, right? And being able to, and some of that, certainly that child play, it brings that back, right? Another population that I think is important to think about are our seniors.
Yes.
Because oftentimes, particularly older people who are no longer in the workforce, et cetera, tend to sort of have quite structured lives that have clear routine, right? And disrupting that routine, just like disrupting it for young children, can be very unsettling. So one of the things that we sometimes see is a little bit of confusion that emerges on the
Okay.
part of older people, particularly if they need to be displaced, if they have
Yes.
to learn a new setting,
Yes,
learn
that
a
makes
new way
sense.
to the bathroom at night, those kinds of things. So the degree to which we can provide some ancillary supports to that can ease some of that. I think one of the things that I always recommend, night lights
Okay.
at
Okay,
night,
that's
right?
great.
So that I know a new pathway, but I can see my way to
Yes.
it,
Yes.
right? Being able to also think about ways to try to bring some of that routine back, or to again reconnect people with community. So, our senior centers are wonderful places where
Yes.
there's opportunities for people to play, to hang out, to talk, to commiserate. So, the degree to which perhaps people might get connected to those for the first time,
Yes.
that can be very
Yeah.
powerful and supportive. And again, to also reassure and remind people that, just like we do with children, that, we're doing our best to bring things back,
Yes.
but it may take
Yeah.
time.
Well, and I think like having those conversations, with children, with, older people in our lives, like, what kind of things do you think are important to say? Because I think sometimes maybe if you're in the middle of the adult who's trying to handle
Yeah.
it, you just are like, I'll just take care of it.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe having those conversations can be really important.
Yeah, I think it's important for the narrative, especially with children, to be about, we're safe right now and we're going to do
Yes.
the best to stay that way. We can't make promises we can't keep,
Yeah.
right? Because when we think about anyone prior to a disaster, my job is to keep you safe.
Yes.
Well, sometimes we are all at risk together,
Yes.
right? So I think being able to say, we're going to do the things that we need to do to be safe. We're going to do the best that we can to, either rebuild our home or find a new place to
Yes.
live, etc. But it may take some time, right? And to sort of not create expectations where it's
Yes.
going to happen overnight.
Right.
And I think in many ways our children think of us as magical, right? We can make everything okay. I can kiss your boo-boo and it's all better. And this is hard. This is
Yes.
not exactly the same kind of situation. So I think also reinforcing for those who are fortunate enough for everyone to be safe and healthy, to be able to reinforce that that's what's important.
Yes.
That we're together, we love each other, we're going to stand by each other, and we're going to do the best we can.
Yes.
But it's,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think it's a really good point, because as parents, you do just want everything to be okay. It's hard to see your child in pain or afraid, and so you want to say the thing that's going to make them feel better, but that's in the short term, and then in reality, they'll be like, but wait, we're not back in our house, or everything's not okay, or I'm not at my
Right.
same school.
Right.
And so, you don't want them to feel that you were lying to them, in the midst of trying to protect them.
It's interesting. I was at a location where people were picking up mail, and there was this little boy who had like his superhero cape on, and he was like 6 years old, and he was waiting. His parents were getting their mail, and someone said to him, "How you doing?" He goes, "Fire's got nothing on me."
Oh.
Right? So he's kind of like, I
Sounds like a
came out the
6-year-old.
other side of this,
Yeah.
right?
Oh,
And
sweet.
being able to reinforce that, because there is that resilience. We got out of there,
Yes.
right? And we're safe.
Yes.
Right. So I think those kinds of things are important to reinforce for our children, and also for ourselves,
Yes.
right? To remind ourselves that, if we can be in a place of safety and security, albeit not exactly what we were used to or wanted,
Yes.
that's what's really important.
Yes. It's so valuable. And I think understanding how to talk to children in our lives, how to talk to like maybe the elderly people in our lives. And you mentioned also another, different population, first responders. What happens for first responders in disasters like this?
Well, I think that there are certain organizations, for example, that work with firefighters or law enforcement personnel, et cetera, where they often have in-house support services through, that provide mental health support and so forth. I think, one of the real challenges, and I think especially with firefighters, right? We honor them, we respect them, we revere them, but their job, right? That many of them, part of their being is about saving lives
Yes.
and saving property. And when that doesn't happen, often absolutely out of their control, it's destabilizing,
Yes.
right?
Feels like a failure for them,
So,
I'm
yeah,
sure.
so being able to have opportunities within their teams to talk about these things, and most fire services provide those things in house. But I think, it's also really important for us to recognize that there are things that sometimes they ask us to do when we're not in disaster that we're reticent to.
People,
Like,
yes,
get that
ignore.
brush away from your house.
That's right. You're right.
Check your
You're
smoke
right.
detectors and do all of that.
Yes.
And, those things feel like impositions, but they really are there to help us, right?
Yes.
So I think that in our honoring and thanking and being mindful about those things, one of the best ways we can honor and thank them is to get smart about how we protect our homes, how we protect ourselves in the event of an emergency.
Yes.
Because again, in a disaster, when everybody's calling 911, when everything is huge, they can't be everywhere at once,
Yes.
right?
Absolutely.
So the more we're prepared, the better.
I think we definitely will, get into like what people can do and what you can do, whether you're fined, you're just a witness to it, or if you're impacted. I think we should definitely talk about that. And I've heard you say, talk about the honeymoon period after
Yes.
disaster. Can you explain what that is?
Sure, yeah. So if we think about a disaster, we often think about this kind of arc. So, we're tooling along and everything's fine. And then something hits, right? And there's this big thing that happens. And immediately following that, we go in a honeymoon period, right? Everybody's activated. Everybody, we're having fundraisers.
We're
People
helping,
are donating
yes.
things. We're helping. We saw, for example, with these fires that, within days, there were places that were saying, we can't take any more.
right.
We can't.
That's right.
We have too much. The response is too big. So you have this initial honeymoon period, and we're out of that now. Usually that lasts about a month.
Okay.
And then we start to dip down and we go into this period of disillusionment. Okay. And often what happens is for people who weren't directly impacted, it's been a couple of months, they've moved on with their lives.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
It's not front and center.
That's right.
It's not on the news every day anymore. We're talking about other things. We're focusing on other things. And there are still lots of people whose lives are fundamentally disrupted.
Yes.
The other thing that happens in that disillusionment period is often what people refer to as the secondary disaster for survivors, which is dealing with all of the bureaucracies, the insurance companies, all of the aid places where you've got to fill out a form and you've got to do this and, it's been delayed, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And it can just become overwhelming and frustrating because these things move very slowly. So, while there's a desire, I want to get back in my home or I want to get this resolved, there's a wait and see. It takes weeks, it takes months, it takes a very long time for things to happen. And during that time, I think it's really important for people to develop really basic strategies that will reduce some of the stressors associated with that.
What are your recommendations?
So I have a few.
Well, I think there's such an emotional load to handling that I think we underestimate until you're in the middle of it.
Right. And I think there are a few things, and I know this is going to sound really silly, but it's important. So if someone says to you, this process is going to take 2 to 4 weeks, you need to think about 4 weeks and a day or two.
Okay.
Right? So that you're not at the 2-week period chomping at the bit and why is this not happening? Because that's going to make the situation more stressful. So I always say, if you can mark your calendar, I submitted this, it was good to go, it was complete, I know it's in. They said 2 to 4 weeks, so I'm looking at 4 weeks and a day or two.
Okay, so
Give 'em
managing our own expectations.
Right, exactly, exactly. And if they say business days, count it. And if there's a
Yes.
holiday in there, count it.
Yes.
Don't count it,
Yeah.
right? And that way, maybe you get it in 3 weeks and then you're ahead of the game. And that's a little bit of a
Yes.
boost. But
Oh, that's interesting.
sometimes our expectations in that way are so intense. You know, the other thing that people often have to do is make phone calls, trying to follow up on the phone. And, you know, most places, particularly government entities, have time frames when people answer the phone. So if they say we start at 8, if you call at 7:45, they're going to say our hours are, et cetera. I always say, be the first one in line, because most call centers will hold people in line, right?
Okay.
If you call at noon, and there's already
Yes.
100 people,
Yes.
then you're really far. If you call at 8 and they start at 8, you might be the 50th person, but you are definitely closer to, in the queue than you would be if you're calling late in the afternoon.
Yes.
And definitely, earlier in the week is often better, or like people sometimes say Tuesday is better than Monday because everybody's chomping at the bit on Monday.
That makes
But,
sense.
you know, the earlier in the day, the more likely you're going to get a response. And that's the other thing. You know, if you only have 15 minutes to make that phone call, in all likelihood, you're not going to get it
through to
taken
someone,
care of.
yes.
So I think it's also thinking about how can you manage your expectations in that way. And then the third thing, you know, and it goes without saying, but it's very hard when we're in very stressful positions and frustrated, to get annoyed with the person on the other end
Oh, yes.
is not going to move the ball.
It's not productive.
forward.
Yes.
It can be, you know, one can express the frustration without raising one's voice, without all of those things, explain the impact, etc. And that often is heard and understood in a much better way than if it's coming with loud and accusatory and so forth.
Yes.
So, and I know that that's very hard to do. I almost think about it like it's like in training. You know, you think about the movies with the boxers.
boxers.
You got to train yourself. I'm going to be calm, cool, and
Yes.
collected here.
Yeah. And it sounds like you've seen a lot of this in action, like ways that it's not done well and like ways
Yeah.
that you see that it's more productive.
Yeah, and you know, I've done a lot of work, for example, in disaster application centers where people, you know, are coming in to fill out paperwork for the SBA or FEMA, et cetera. And, you know, when people escalate, you automatically see the person on the receiving end start to retreat. And then they kind of can't even hear it anymore, right? So, and again, that managing, taking a deep breath, you know, saying, you know, and I often lead with, I understand that you don't have control over this.
Yeah. Yes.
But here's where I am.
Even saying that, I think
Yeah.
is so important because, you know, you still have to see, you know, that human behind the form,
Exactly.
and that probably wants to help, you know, and maybe some things are out of their control, the way that so many things are out of your own control when you're trying to manage it. So I think it's really useful.
And I think for folks, it can also be really helpful in dealing with organizations, agencies, disaster relief, et cetera. If you have the ability to have someone who is not in the thick of it in the same way go with you,
Okay.
to be your note taker, almost like a healthcare advocate, but the same thing,
Okay, I
right?
like that
Someone
idea.
who can be with you, write things down,
Yes.
ask the question
Yes.
maybe in a more pointed way.
Uh-huh.
You know, say, let me make sure I get this. If we do this, this, and this, these things will happen, so that they can help maintain the record of things, maintain, you know,
Yes.
and do that, because it can be overwhelming. There is nothing user-friendly about any of this. I think for a lot of people applying for disaster relief, it's kind of like doing your taxes. It's kind of like, here's the forms, fill it out and figure it out. And most of us
Yes,
look at
have
it
trouble or need help.
Somebody needs to help me here.
And I think that that's probably something that we don't necessarily think about because someone who is not, who is, knows where they're going home to and doesn't have those kinds of, they can just be present in a different way.
Exactly.
And it's so emotional and personal for us if we're in that situation. So I think it's such a great piece of advice for all of us to think about and kind of like planting a seed, for when something happens, these
Exactly.
things that we can do.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so when have you seen, or like in what situations have you seen where people are able to like, I don't know if recover is the way that the word that I want to use, like in that way, but you've seen that some of these actions have been put into place and people are able to rebuild, maybe, rebuild their lives in a different way.
Well, I think one of the things that we don't spend enough time talking about, which is crucial, is rebuilding community. How can people reconnect with communities that are important to them? So, if much of a neighborhood has been lost, et cetera. We've heard stories of neighbors who are in touch with each other, but also thinking about those touch points in those important places for people, the library, the gym,
Yeah.
right?
Coffee shop.
The coffee shop, the places of worship,
Yes.
right? And, I know that most places of worship, for example, when people are displaced because the place where they went is no longer able to hold services, et cetera, contacting other places in the vicinity can often say to someone, oh, your minister, your priest, your rabbi is at this location now, right? So that can help people to kind of reconnect with that which is familiar.
Yes.
And there's something very powerful about that. Being able to be with people that are familiar.
Yes.
As I was saying, and I was talking about being at that place where they were distributing mail, there was this little girl who showed up with her mother. And what they did, which was brilliant, is they had the mail carriers from the neighborhood there. And this little girl comes running through the parking lot, screaming at her postal man because she knows him and he
Yes.
knows her, and she jumped into his arms and it's so good to see you, right? So the ability to create those kinds of touch points. I know that I heard a radio piece about a library reopening in Altadena, and all of the interviews of people, it feels like home.
Yes.
This is where we came. This is where we bring our kids. So being able, when things can be rebuilt, to go back,
Yes.
or to find something that is similar.
Okay. That is comforting in that way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to kind of try to find those routines again, right? If we went to the library every Friday with our kids, maybe we find another branch that's close to where we are and do that again.
Okay.
And
All
meet a
right.
new librarian.
Yes, right. And have new memories around that.
Exactly.
I think that is important for us to think about now. What else can we do at this point, right? Especially as you see the public attention is fading, and as it does, right? People want to get on with their lives or have to get on with their lives.
Right.
And I think right now, especially, there's so many other things competing for people's attention. That it's difficult to remember, our friends and neighbors, who are not okay right now.
Right. So I think, I think that there are going to continue to be charitable outreach and organizations that are going to be, for lack of a better term, the boots on the ground.
Okay.
So, I think for people who have not been directly impacted, to maybe do a little bit of homework about sort of grassroots local organizations, not the big national ones, but the local community centers that are continuing to provide support. And to maybe think about, what, if we do spring cleaning, we're going to hold the clothes, we're going to fold everything up that's nice, because that's still going to be a need for people.
That's right.
That, if we're going to get new dishes or whatever, maybe the ones that we had are still going to work for somebody else. And maybe we think about those organizations, maybe it takes a little more effort to get to them, but who are going to directly support people. Yes. I think for folks who feel like they want to do more, I think there are lots of of charitable organizations that haven't started their work yet,
Okay.
but are going to. So one that comes to mind is Habitat for Humanity.
Okay.
Once people start rebuilding, they're going to gear up,
I
and they are
see.
probably going to be building homes in Altadena.
Yes.
So that's, and that's a wonderful thing that a family can do, right? You get
Yes.
together, you put your stuff on and go and build a house for somebody,
It really
right?
is amazing. Yeah.
So there are lots of things like that that will come up, because I think we have to also think about rebuilding is going to take time.
Yes.
It's not going to happen overnight. So there are going to be continuing opportunities for people to lend a hand if that's what they want to do.
Yes.
And for people who are in a position to give of their time or give, to donate money, to really think, how about thinking really hyper-local? What is something that is in that community that might be important to people who live in that community, or something that I appreciate in my own community? Maybe I appreciate the senior center, and I know they're rebuilding a senior center, so maybe next year that's where I'm going to donate money to support that effort in a community that I want to support. Right?
That's right. And I mean, you really get to see the impact of your work, or, if you're able to donate. And I do think also there is something that happens to us that's very powerful for our emotional state and well-being when you kind of, roll up your sleeves and you're helping people,
Exactly.
who are directly benefiting. In a way, of course, I'm sure checks are great and no one's going to turn down a check. But, that's not available to everyone. And
Right,
so,
right.
but doing work, getting in there, is available to
And
people.
there are going to be parks that are going to get rebuilt,
Yes.
et cetera. And and in many cases there'll be days where it's going to be like, the plants are here, we're going to plant the trees,
And
we're
the
going to,
volunteers, you
and
need to find them.
we need
Yes,
some
yes,
people to come and dig a
yes.
hole and put it in,
Yes,
right? So
yeah.
I think there's going to be, there will be those opportunities for quite some time, because it will take time for things to be rebuilt.
Yeah. And thinking about that, how do you recommend that people balance that desire for everything to be okay with kind of going back into it? You're kind of going back into the trenches. If I'm going into this community and I'm going to rebuild what was lost. What do you recommend for people to take care of themselves?
Well, I think that one of the things that is important when people are essentially rebuilding a community from scratch, there are opportunities to rethink, perhaps putting some new things there that maybe weren't there before, right? Because I think it's important. We can't, even if someone completely rebuilds their house exactly the way it was before, it's still not the same, right?
Yes.
So I think we have to temper that expectation. And maybe it can be, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be better, but to be okay with the idea that it might be different than it was,
Yes.
right? And to prepare ourselves for the fact that it might be different from what it was. Because if I had beloved neighbors, they might not all come back,
That's right.
If I really, had fun with the person down the street and they decided that they don't want to rebuild, there may be somebody else living in that home.
Yes.
And, so being able to adapt to that, to adapt to the fact that it might not come back looking exactly the way that it was, but that doesn't mean that because it's not the same, that it's less than.
Yes.
It's just
Different.
unique,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
And sometimes we have to embrace that.
Yeah, I think so. I think that when you experience any kind of loss, right, then it's like you kind of can put like that life on a pedestal. Everything was perfect. This was amazing. Nothing else is ever going to be as good, or good, maybe sometimes even nothing else is ever going to be good. And now thinking about it in a different way and having different language around it,
Right.
I think can be really useful to people.
Absolutely. And to really, I think temper our expectations. If we think about, if anyone who grew up somewhere where they don't live now, if you go back where you grew up,
It's
10
not the
years
same.
or 20 years,
I've done that. It's
like,
not the same.
Where did that go? What happened, right? Well,
Yes.
that's kind of that also, that moving forward.
Yes.
The other place that I think people can be involved are people perhaps who live in impacted communities who, are not trying to completely rebuild from scratch, but maybe whose homes survived, who might want to become more engaged and involved in civic things, going to board, town board meetings, et cetera, to have a voice in how are things going to get rebuilt.
Yes.
This is an opportunity for people to engage their city council folks, their representatives, and say, wait, whoa, no, we don't want that. We want this. We don't
Yes.
want people deciding for us.
Mm-hmm.
But there may be things that, people might want to get involved in. I met someone last week who is starting a grassroots group who is, their whole goal is going to be to lobby for there to be no above ground electrical wiring.
Amazing.
Put it
Amazing.
underground, right? And it's
Yes.
like, well, that might be
Yes.
something, right? So perhaps getting involved in those kinds of things, or maybe, if you're going to redesign a park, or if you're going to whatever, here's some things that weren't in the one that we had before that
Yes.
we'd like to see.
Yes. Yes, and I think it's such an empowering way to take action, and also what you're describing as far as people who might go to city council meetings now. If you're in a position to advocate for yourself in your community and be that voice for people who are not either, maybe they're not physically there, or emotionally they're not in that space where they can go and say this is what we need. To
Exactly.
be able to use your power in that way, I think is so valuable.
Yeah, and that when you talk about recovery, right, that post-disaster recovery,
Yeah.
that can be a very powerful piece to
Yes.
be an agent of being engaged in how is this space going to be rebuilt.
Absolutely. So I think that's really helpful in terms of what you can do. And I know you have some other very practical tips about because to your point, there's right now, well, maybe a few weeks ago, it's really top of mind. And you're thinking, okay, if I had to leave, this is what I would take. If I was home, this is what I would want to do. And then we forget.
Yeah.
We go on. We're like, okay, survived that one. But I know you've seen so many times, and seen this play out over and over. And so, what do you think people can do now? Whether you've been impacted or you haven't been impacted, what are some other things you can do?
So, one of the things that we do know, which is interesting, is following a disaster, usually within the months following a disaster, that's when people are most likely to get prepared.
Okay.
Right? That's when disaster preparation supplies start getting purchased.
You can't
People
buy
are
them
ordering
anywhere, yes.
online, right? Yeah. One of the things that I think about a lot is the emotional toll that loss takes when people lose those invaluable things,
Yes.
the family photographs, the artwork from their kids, et cetera. It's heartbreaking, often when we see footage, of people who are evacuating, and they're carrying the photo albums and they're trying to find all of those things. While yes, having water and blankets and food and so forth, there's some things that I think are really essential that can bring great peace of mind. So one of the most important ones that I don't think we talk about enough when nothing's happening, if people have medication that is necessary to sustain them,
Yes.
it is really important to have a conversation with their healthcare provider to see if they can get an extra prescription
Yes.
so that can be in a go bag or something. And then that's something that you just kind of get in the habit of,
Yes.
switching it out,
Yes.
right? Having that. Certainly for people who, for example, if we think about people who are on insulin where there's refrigeration that's necessary, et cetera, there are, some things that are, they're created for lunch that are bags that already have the stuff built into the walls of it. So you don't have to have these packs and things, to have that in the freezer at all times. So if we're going to go, I'm going to throw everything, all the insulin I have in there and we're out of here. And at least it will keep it refrigerated for sometimes I think up to 48 hours, and that allows to be able to do something else. I think the other thing is having access to one's documents. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. If one loses their passport, their driver's license, most of us don't know our bank account numbers by heart, et cetera. Having those things stored somewhere, right? So taking photographs of or scanning your passport, your driver's license, your social security card, the deed to your house, all of those things in the event that those documents get lost, you're in a much better position and a
Definitely.
starting point if you can show somebody, here's what it was.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I heard an interview this morning on the radio, and someone was saying, I'm exhausted and I'm overwhelmed, and I don't even feel that I have any path forward because I call this person. I'm trying to prove that I am who I say I am. And on top of, just this, I think incredible tragedy that you're enduring, you're also the bureaucracy. And if you are starting from scratch, from your point, it's really hard to prove all of those things and get the information that you need.
Right. So having that, and if you're a store it in the cloud person, store it in the cloud. If you're more of a flash drive kind of person, store it on a flash drive you have access to. You can also store photographs of your driver's license things on your phone. Put it on a flash drive and make a copy of it and give it to someone else, so that if
Someone
you're
who doesn't
not
live
home,
with you, ideally,
someone that
that's
doesn't
great.
live in
Yeah.
your household, so that you can get access to those things. And I also think we can do that with the things that are emotional to us. Take photographs of your children's artwork. Take pictures of the pictures that you love.
Yeah.
Make sure that the photographs that are on your phone that you love are also stored somewhere else, because phones sometimes don't survive.
Yeah.
either,
No, that's true.
right? So
That's true.
being able to, and that's the kind of thing that, for one's own sense of well-being, to be able to go, I know where that is.
Yes.
I had to walk away, but I know where it is.
Yes.
And I can at least access that drawing that my 3-year-old did.
Right, because I think we forget, like, in this age where so many of the photos we're taking are on our phones, and you think you have all the things, but there are some that you can't replace. And I was telling you, when we evacuated, I grabbed my parents' wedding album. That was way before people had cell phones.
Exactly.
I can't get those photos again. And I was looking for my son's baby book and all of these kinds of things, and realizing that they were all in different parts of the house. Some things were not easily accessible. And so taking the time now when it is calmer to take photos of those, and I have them, and I've done what was in my power to do in order to be prepared. And I think that makes you feel differently when something else happens.
Yeah, and it's also interesting, if we think about particularly those things that were done before we had phones and all of that, the photos degrade, all of that degrades.
true.
So if you can capture them in a photograph, right, in a digital photograph, that will live.
Oh, that's such a good
Right?
point. That's such a good point. It's
So
true.
yeah, and I think that because those are the kinds of things that people often find to be the most distressing after a disaster, when those things have been lost.
Yes.
So it may not be the album. It may not be your parents' album with, and the tender loving care that it took to put all those photographs in there, but you can still capture it.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And it can
the
still be a
emotion.
series of images that you keep.
Okay. That's wonderful.
And I think that those are the kinds of things that are important. And then it goes without saying, having disaster supplies, having water, food, etc., where we work, at home,
Yes.
in our cars, just in case. And one special thing that I want to say, particularly for parents, know your child's school's disaster evacuation plan.
Oh, okay. That's
Because
important.
every school has to have an alternative location where they are going to take your children in the event of a disaster.
Yes.
And the last thing you want to do is show up and nobody's there.
Yes. Yes. Oh, that's
You
such
want
a
to
good
know where
point.
that is. And if for some reason, and that's the other thing that is so important for parents, and I know it's mind-boggling and it's annoying and irritating when, at the beginning of the school year, there's all these forms. And
That you
gotta
just
put-
fill out,
yeah,
sign
yeah.
your name to.
Right.
Yes.
And again, but making sure that your information is up to date, making sure that the list of people that are the contacts for your child,
Yes.
that you lead with the person who's closest to the school.
Okay.
Because if there's an emergency, you don't want to be, in San Bernardino having to come to North
right.
Hollywood
That's right.
if you have someone in Burbank.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So, because that also creates some peace of mind in an emergency, and just knowing what what the alternatives are and where your children will likely go in the event of an emergency so that you can go directly there.
That's
Right.
it's such good advice. You know, I'm gonna take this advice because it's not something you think, okay, well, I've done all that. I know that they have my information. I know where they're going, but those kinds of things that can just alleviate some of that stress and worry in the moment.
And sometimes, it can be, it can be quite disconcerting. Just as a personal example, my son was enrolled in a school that was very close to LAX. On 9/11, and the police arrived at the school. We were in the morning dropping kids off, and they said, you have to evacuate the school. And the last child wasn't picked up until 2:00 in the afternoon.
Oh my goodness.
And it's like, because we were calling around to different people, so if you change your phone number, if you do that, top of mind needs to be that place where those little ones go needs to know that.
Absolutely.
and
No,
it has to be, it's not an email. It has to be, go to the office. We need to change this right now.
Okay.
Because we never know.
That's right. And it's so easy for us to get caught up in our own lives in our day to day and not do these things. But I think it's so helpful that you are sharing your years of experience because you've seen what happens, or the difference, I guess, when those things are done and when they're not. And how that aids in us kind of getting through this disaster. I'm curious to know from you, like, you've seen a lot, and this obviously hits very close to home for us here in Los Angeles, but there's disasters and terrible things that are happening all the time. How do you think that this work has changed how you look at things that impact other people? Do you know what I mean? Like,
well, I think it's interesting. When I was in graduate school, I was a resilience researcher. I studied
were you
resilience
really?
in children.
I didn't know that was a thing.
Yeah. It's kind of followed me around in lots of ways. I'm not actively doing that now, but that is the thing to me that is the most powerful, is to really embrace how incredibly resilient human beings are. Right?
Yes.
We can figure it out and get it together when we have to. And sometimes, surmounting things that just exceed our knowledge and our capacity. I think I might have mentioned this to you, but I always, in that vein, there are two things that always I think about. So three things. So I appreciate that we are, just as a species, very resilient.
Yes.
Our children are resilient, our elders are resilient. And the two sort of historical things that I always reflect on, that when I get to that point where I'm like, oh no, I remind myself, right? I think about slavery, and you think about people being stripped of culture, food, language, everything, and coming out the other end and building and creating and making families and getting educations and creating businesses. That's resilience.
Yes. And creating joy.
Right. And creating joy and music and art and, the other sort of incredibly person-made, again, devastating thing I think about is the Holocaust. And you have people who came out of concentration camps with no one and nothing left and built families and built business, just did all that, created joy. Right. So we all have that capacity. Yes. Right. And I think about that little boy. Fire's not going to get me.
Right. Yes.
Right?
Like it is within us. Right. Yeah. Sometimes we have to dig a little bit more and try to find it. But
absolutely,
it's such an important reminder.
Absolutely. And, I think we are biologically driven to survive, and we fight it.
Yes.
And I think, giving ourselves the grace to go, sometimes things are hard. There's no question about it. Sometimes things are hard. And sometimes we feel like taking another step or getting out of bed is going to be impossible. But there can always be something on the other side if we do it.
Yes.
Right?
Well, and it reminds me of, what you were sharing about hearing children laugh. It's like, that's a wake up. Okay. Yes, I have this in me. I can do this. People have done these kinds of things before, and I'm capable of doing it as well. And these other people in my life, they need me to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we need each other, right? We need each other to be able to do it, to support each other, to remind us ourselves. I think it's very, and we live in a time where it's very easy for people to get very lonely and very isolated.
Yes, absolutely.
To go down the rabbit hole, and I'm looking at my phone and hours have gone by.
I haven't talked to another human.
Right. And again, if we can kind of put that away and just spend some time with people, and post disaster, people sometimes have financial challenges, etc. Go for a walk.
Yes.
Right? Get outside, get some fresh air. Coming over here. I mean, it's a beautiful day today.
It is.
It's like, we should, take your kids out if you have children, or, take grandma or grandpa
or a neighbor who doesn't have anyone to visit them.
Yeah, exactly. And just say, let's just walk down the block and see what's happening, right?
Yes.
Get a little change of scenery, get out of our head, get out of our rabbit holes,
Yes.
and kind of look
Doom
around
scrolling.
and see what's happening.
Yes.
Right?
That's wonderful. Dr. Taylor, thank you so much. It's been such a valuable conversation. And I really appreciate, you sharing your expertise, but also what people can do moving forward, what we can do today, and what's available to us also, to help rebuild, our community together. So thank you so much for your time.
And thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Wonderful.